Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock. The Netherlands is in lockdown today, not because of Corona, but because of our storm Eunice that is joining us. So we are all online again, like the old days. Today we have two PhD students who will present their work, and I'm really excited that they're here. I think if any type of employee at the university has suffered through the pandemic, it are PhD students, because they have not had in-person conferences. They had not had the opportunity to walk around freely through the building and ran into colleagues to just ask for advice, and have also had much less of the community that you might want at times during your PhD when you're struggling with your advisors or your papers or whatever other things. So it's really nice that also so many of you showed up today to come and listen to two excellent PhD students. Today first we have Chiara Vialli from the University of Bern. Chiara used to study in the research master program at communication science, and has worked extensively with Alessandro Nai, has already published a couple of papers, and will talk about her work today on personality and information consumption. So Chiara, I won't take up your valuable time, but give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Bert, for that nice introduction. I'm just quickly gonna share my screen. Can you see the screen? Yeah, okay, good. So welcome everyone. As Bert said, my name is Chiara and I am a PhD student at the University of Bern. And today I'm very happy to present to you one of my dissertation projects, in which I'm investigating how the big 5 personality traits relate to people's political information consumption, specifically focusing on the mediating role of news use motives. Okay, yeah. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the big 5, because I'm sure that most of you are already familiar with the framework. We have collected the data already, however, we're still in the pre-processing phase, which is why, unfortunately, I cannot present any results at this point, but I'm still looking forward to your feedback regarding my theoretical framework. So very basically, in contrast to other characteristics, we believe that personality traits are stable aspects of individuals throughout a person's lifetime. And personality psychologists have come up with an integrative framework that tries to capture the complexity of personality on 5 key dimensions, with which you're probably familiar with. I listed them here. So just very briefly, we have the dimension of openness to experience, which describes the extent to which individuals seek intellectual stimulation. So they're known to be very curious in nature. We have the dimension of conscientiousness, which describes individuals who are usually very reliable, very self-disciplined, and who have like a very strong sense of personal obligation. Then extroverted individuals are known to seek social interaction, so they feel very confident and comfortable in social settings. Agreeable individuals, on the other hand, they're also very sociable. However, they need harmonious relationships, so they're known to be rather conflict avoidant. And then last, we have neuroticism, which is also known under the name emotional stability, which describes individuals who are rather anxious, a bit tense, not very emotionally stable, and who, very broadly have strong emotional reactions to external stimuli. So in recent years, research and literature has tried to explore how the big 5 personality traits relate to the political world. And when I started reading into the literature, I soon noticed that the argumentation is very similar across studies, almost regardless of the dependent political outcome variable that they're looking at. And what I realized, or how I interpret the literature, and I hope you agree with me on that, is that research almost implicitly claims that there are underlying motives that drive the relationship between the personality traits and the political outcome variables. So I'm just going to briefly summarize these relationships I want to stress here that these are theoretical assumptions only, and that not all of these have received empirical evidence. Very broadly, what literature says is that the main connecting mechanism between openness and political world is the exchange of ideas. So again, open people are very curious. So what they particularly enjoy about politics is the exchange of ideas. And this should be the motive as to why they engage, particularly in political activities that contain that element of exchanging ideas, like, for example, political discussions. Conscientious individuals, on the other hand, are said to engage with the political world mostly out of a sense of personal obligation, which can be translated into a sense of civic duty. So these individuals are expected to mostly participate in activities that are to some extent a citizen's responsibility, like, for example, voting. Extroverted individuals, on the other hand, are expected to participate in politics mostly for their need for social interactions. And here we claim that politics in nature is social. So these individuals are most likely to participate or expected to participate in activities that contain that social elements, like political events, rallies, etc. And then lastly, the relationship between the last two big five personality traits and politics is a bit more nuanced. Here, literature says that their interaction or engagement with politics mostly relies on the extent to which that specific activity contains a potential for negativity or conflict. So, for example, since agreeable individuals are very conflict avoidant, they would probably stay away from political activities such as protests. So as I said, this is a very general argumentation that you find in almost all studies, and they're very clear, and these mechanisms are very straightforward and also rather intuitive. I soon realized then, however, that we have a lack of studies that investigate these underlying mechanisms. So most of the studies that look at these relationships look at the main effects or the direct effects of these personality traits on the political outcome variable, but neglect what is going on or the causal mechanisms in between. And this is especially problematic, I think, in this field because we do have very mixed findings in certain areas. So this is what brings me to my study, in which I'm trying to test and maybe verify is a big word, but to verify the theoretical foundations for these theoretical assumptions. And I'm doing so in the context of political information consumption, using or translating these underlying mechanisms, these psychological motives, into news use motives, with which you might be familiar from the uses and gratification literature. So very basically, I'm trying to analyze if different personality types pursue different news use motives, and if so, how these affect the political information consumption of people. So I think this is rather straightforward. Again, you're probably familiar with the literature. Just very briefly, I would expect that open individuals consume more political information out of a need to know. Again, they're very curious. They seek that intellectual stimulation. Conscientious people would probably consume political information out of a sense of civic duty, so the duty of being politically informed. This is probably especially the case in campaign settings where making an informed vote choice is almost considered the responsibility of a good citizen. Extroverted individuals would be expected to consume political information for the social returns that they gain from it. And here I make the assumption that being politically informed, again, in a campaign setting and a campaign period, facilitates the social interactions between peers, family, friends, etc. And then lastly, if we agree on that news reporting nowadays has some kind of negative bias and is overwhelmingly negative, we would expect that agreeable and neurotic people tend to stay away out of their need to avoid contentious experiences, because that would give them some sense of uneasiness. So how am I testing these relationships? So we collected data in the 2021 German federal election with 3 survey waves, and I just see I missed one of the waves in my illustration here, where I collected the variables necessary for my studies, and in between We tracked people's online behavior via a plugin which the participants installed on their desktop, and basically tracked all of their activities online. As I said, we're still processing the data. It is a huge data set, obviously, with lots of data points, and we're currently trying to extract the political information from all the information that we gathered from these participants. And I'm planning to analyze this data then using structural equation modeling. For those who are not familiar with that type of analysis, it has two main benefits, or I see two main benefits. First, it will allow me to test this rather complex mediation model in one single analysis, in contrast to normal OLS regressions, where I would have to look at these relationships separately. And because it gives me an indication of the model fit, which means it will show me how my assumptions fit the observed data, I can make some statements about the plausibility of causality. So these are my main reasons, and this is what I'm planning to do. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara, for this presentation. I have to say, on a day like this, Bert, I have to think about this day when we drove into a tornado a few years ago and almost killed off the entire hot politics leadership. But let's get back to personality. That said nothing about our personality, I have to say. There's also another, I'm not sure if you can hear the storm here in my room, but I have to think about the discussion we had when I hear your story, Chiara, we had with some of our colleagues in Germany, in Mannheim, about our work on the relationship between agreeableness and populism, and they make exactly well, they make kind of a similar claim as you do, that you say that there is something in between personality and an attitude like populist voting that should explain this mechanism. And there's a whole back and forth about this. It was never published, so if you're sort of interested in reading that, we can share it with you. But one of the, and I think it would be useful for you, because I mean, we also leveled some of the critiques against mediation analysis, and in the end, the authors that criticized us initially, they never published their criticism. But one of the key things I think that I took from that discussion is should there actually be a mediating attitude between personality and any sort of behavior, just in principle, in abstract terms? I mean, many of the things that personality is about are also about simply unconscious preferences. And so, do we always theoretically expect an intermediate attitude? That's my question. And then the others can ask questions, and you can write them into the Q&A. But first, this question, Chiara.
You're asking if there is always a mediator in between personality and the outcome variable. Well, I think it's a hard question to answer, and I'm not sure if I'm capable of answering it. But what motivated me to analyze it that way is because I just felt that results are not very clear, and we're not moving ahead if we keep on making the same assumptions without actually testing them, because only then, when we see that these underlying mechanisms might work in a different direction, we can move on and we can explain the mixed findings. But it is true what you say, that probably personality, rather implicitly than explicitly, influences these mechanisms in between, and it's questionable to what extent individuals can maybe capture these motives, for example, in my specific case. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that I have an absolute answer to your question.
No, but I think my underlying suggestion is to think there are many different routes that personality can motivate different attitudes. This is not always via explicit attitudes. Okay, there's a question from Patrick Stewart's. this promises to be fascinating. I'm excited to see the results. Do you measure attending political events? It would be interesting to see if those attending rallies, demonstrations, debates, etc., are similar in personality.
Well, basically, I would have the data for it. We work with a rather big survey, so I'm sure that we also asked participation question, but the main focus was on media consumption. So I didn't plan to analyze other political outcome variables, but it might be interesting to dig in these mechanisms as well.
Okay, good. Again, there are a lot of new people here today, so if you have any questions for Chiara, you can type them into the Q&A box, like Patrick just did. There's an.
So I just posted the response that you were referring to, Gijs, in the chat because
it is online.
Yeah, it's a preprint, but normally it's one of these things that we spend time on, but nobody read. Hey, Chiara, I'm gonna, now that I'm talking, I'm gonna ask you a question as well. I'm first gonna say something. I think you underestimate one innovation that you have that we haven't seen much, is that you have behavior. And so I don't know if you need to study that mechanism, because it's also a bit conditional on how you consider mechanisms, right? But given that you do, as I understand the research design, do not much more, and I mean this in a respect, but correlating personality with certain self-reported needs, will never know what the causal ordering is. And to be honest, there I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't think that structural equation modeling gives you much to prove that. But what you do have is behavior in the political information world. And if personality should do something, we should not only see it in like, hey, how interested are you in politics, but you should have a behavioral index of interest in politics. And so what I would be curious to see is, the question that I have is, would the paper that you could write with this data not be answering the question, do we see the cross-sectional correlations between personality and certain patterns of information consumption? Do we see that showing up when we have their actual behavior? And I don't know what the answer is. I think both could be interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, it might be true that I'm underestimating the
In fact, I think you might be losing the contribution if you go into that mechanism story, because it might actually not be a mechanism story, because it's really conditioned what you see mechanisms. But I think you might just say, well, these are things that are somewhere in a causal space related to each other, but we'll never know with this design. But your powerful design is that you know what these people did on the internet, at least on their desktop.
Yeah, no, I think what you can see and how I framed the whole story is that I feel closer to political science and have to adjust to political information in that sense, which is why I probably also didn't emphasize this part of the story as much, because I would be, as Patrick said, very interested in other outcome variables as well. But it's very true that I have a huge benefit that I can actually, that I have actual data, like real-time data.
Yeah. And that is actually very close to some of the interest of political scientists, right? If that's what the audience you're interested in, because think about Marcus Pryor's work about political interest. And in his book, there's a whole chapter on personality and interest, and that is all based on the self-reports. Mm-hmm. So you have some behavioral indicators. In fact, as I remember correctly, it's only Alan Gerber who has one paper with registered turnouts. But for the rest, we have not been moving much further than correlating personality with other self-reported things. And you have, for information, have something that is somewhat close to behavior. If I understand correctly, you even did this during the pandemic, which would make the case for the desktop even not such a bad case, because people would probably spend quite
so we let Chiara answer the question.
Yeah, no, so that No, but I think that this is my you do have the contribution there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very true. Although I think we will probably all agree that tracking data, it's probably we come a bit closer to, yeah, but it has its other biases as well, right? But definitely, I think it's more advanced than self-reports, and I will probably contribute to the ongoing discussion by just reporting or making that statement with actual data. So it's very true. But I find it interesting that you say that this is my unique selling point, and that I should even consider, neglecting this whole discussion about the underlying mechanisms. And again, this is probably also one of my personal research interests. I'm usually interested in the mechanisms in between, and to make assumptions about these rather than the main effects. But I'm very happy to discuss this further. If you make a very strong point that I shouldn't neglect it, I might consider it.
Okay, thanks, Chiara. There's another question from Isabella Rabasso. She writes, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your dependent variable. Moreover, do you plan to, well, okay, that's the second question. Let's start there. Can you say a bit more about the dependent variable?
Yeah, so the dependent variable, as I put it in the slides, will just be the mere amount of political information consumption during that time, which I'm probably going to analyze with unique data points that I'm going to aggregate on, I haven't decided on what basis, whether that's going to be on a weekly or on, the basis of the whole time span. We're still discussing on how to define political information. I specifically try to say political information consumption, not political news consumption, because you have to make all kinds of theoretical assumptions on what is political information, what is political information for these people. Do you include blogs and then alternative media? Do you focus on newspaper? But I think the direction is heading towards including all type of information that contains a political element to it. And then, yeah, we're still, mingling with the data and trying to advance our analysis of it, maybe even try and filter out positive and negative information, maybe the ideological direction of the information, which could all be things that I could add to the analysis. But so far, it's rather basic, the amount of political information that people consumed.
So one question that I think Isabella is also asking here is the distinction, whether you make distinctions between different partisan news outlets.
Not so far, no. As I said, it's mostly, I mean, again, all of you that are familiar with the framework, we could make claims and assumptions on how partisan news will play into these mechanisms. But at the moment, I'm really looking at the mere amount. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting point by Isabella, because some research in other areas is really showing that, for example, in social media use, people can be extremely negative about an outgroup, but only amongst themselves. So that they're not really engaging with news that they would oppose, but they're using very contentious language, but just as a way of talking to each other. So that those are two things you might identify as equally negative, but they take place in a different arena.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a question by Christian.
So my question or thought is going in the same direction regarding your relationship regarding agreeableness, which is you expect to be associated with news avoidance, but because you want to avoid the negativity in the news. But what about news that fits your ideological line? So it's not just conscientiousness, but also agreeableness here, that the type of outlet might play a role. Because, well, if I enjoy that news outlet because the other party gets smashed, then I might enjoy that negativity probably.
Yeah, I mean, all of you are touching upon a a sensitive point here, because we have this data and we would love to dig deep into it and really understand the content of it, but we're also, to some extent, because we can't content analyze it manually, right? So we're dependent on other coding mechanisms here, and it is rather difficult to label these articles in terms of negativity, positivity, ideologies, etc. But if we find a way to analyze the data that way, I'm sure I will consider it, because I feel myself that I'm on a rather superficial level here, and I'm making very broad assumptions, and the more I can bring into, the more nuanced my analysis will be. Although I'm not sure. So what you're saying is there's also a possibility that agreeable people would enjoy contentious content as long as in the direction of their ideological position. Could be. Yeah.
Just an idea. Maybe you don't even have to content analyze the individual articles, but I mean, different news outlets have different ideological leanings in Germany. I mean, it's a different if you read Die Welt or if you read the Taz, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that already gives you maybe some idea of what you would expect there.
Yeah, no, I see that point, and I think it is a good idea, and maybe we're going to go down that road. However, then again, we will probably not waste, but not be able to use lots of other data, like online media, because there's so many sources out there. If you track people's actual behavior, it's almost impossible to label them in ideological terms. And I could technically look at this also maybe in a separate analysis, in one analysis that I'm looking at all of the output, and then one that I'm specifically looking at news outlets, because that will definitely be relatively easy to code. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you so much.
Just thinking that maybe there's some sort of database that ranks outlets along ideology. I know there's something like that in the US. Okay, there's a question, and that will be the last question for you. It's Bernard Klem. Great projects. Another question about your outcome, news consumption. Do you also measure self-reported consumption? As you said yourself, desktop traces can be quite limited, and a couple of recent papers show that traces can have great deficiencies too. Truth is probably somewhere between self-reports and traces, so perhaps best measure both. I'm also generally interested what these deficiencies are, if you know them, because I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the deficiency is definitely that there is a certain bias. When people know that they're tracked, they will show different consumption behaviors. I think this is one of the biggest that I am aware of. And I also heard about some studies that really try to analyze the differences between self-reports and web tracking, and it's just, there's such a big discrepancy that is almost unexplainable. So as Bernhard suggested, the truth lies probably somewhere in the middle. That's true. And yes, we did measure self-reported consumption as well, specifically focusing on offline consumption, which I'm probably gonna, if I find a way to handle the data, I'm trying to put these two measurements together to get a better overview on what people consume online and offline. And if I'm not mistaken, we also ask people about their online behavior, which will be a good way to actually compare the two, so the tracking data and their self-reported online behavior.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chiara, for your really interesting presentation. Really interested in what you will deliver. What's the timeline for this?
Probably, I'm hoping summer, the first good draft with first results.
Okay. Okay, exciting. Okay, looking forward to hearing more about your project. Okay, so today we indeed have two presentations. So we just had Chiara Vialli, and now the next presentation is by Maaike Homan, PhD student in the Hot Politics Lab and the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And for our regular guests, we've seen Maaike quite a few times already. But for those of you new here today, Maaike's project is about trying to identify facial mimicry. And the paper she will present today will be more about the consequences of facial expressions of politicians. And we'll have the same format, so 10-minute presentation, and then I will moderate a Q&A.
I'll share my screen. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, okay, perfect. Yes, thanks, Gijs, for the introduction. Yeah, so this is one of the last projects of my PhD, in which I really look at like how much do these emotions now really have an effect if you also take into account issue position and issue salience. And I do this project together with Gijs, and we did a conjoint experiment a couple of weeks ago, and we're planning to do a second study, so all feedback is welcome. So yeah, this is an example, a quite old example of a campaign poster, a little bit creepy, but it shows a clear emotional expression, I think quite angry. And this is also what we're doing in our experiment. So we have these campaign posters in which we have politicians showing an expression and also a statement regarding a certain issue, and then also a certain frame. And this one is quite explicit. And this is from Konrad Adenauer, and it was actually quite successful campaign, as you might know. And so what we want to do is to see how these emotions then affect if you take into account also issue positions, because we do know from literature that emotions can be very persuasive displayed by politicians, and that they sort of give information how a politician is feeling, what their intentions are. And we also know that if politicians, for example, show a lot of happiness, they're smiling, that people evaluate them more positively. Whereas if they show anger, then people actually can evaluate them more negatively, or sometimes also positive. So sometimes people also really like their politician to be angry about something. But what we do not really know yet is how much or to what extent these emotions that politicians show determine vote choice if you take into account issues and issue positions, etc. So that's what we try to do. We first formulated several hypotheses. And the first two concern the comparison between positive emotions versus neutral or negative expressions or emotions, because we think, as I already said, that positive emotions have quite a positive effect. So if a politician displays happiness or smiles, then this has or is known in literature that it shows positive effects. But in the third and fourth hypothesis, we also look at, or we combine the positive and negative categories, because what I also said is that sometimes people really want their politician to be angry about something or passionate about something. So it might also be the case that it's just a politician being emotional versus non-emotional. So that's our third and fourth hypothesis. Then we also wanted to look at whether these emotions are congruent, especially because in this conjoint experiment, we randomize all these emotions in the face, but also in the statements. So it could be that you see a politician smiling a lot, but then the statement is super negative. But this might lead to really a lot of incongruence, and people in general process incongruency a lot worse than congruency. And we also know that if politicians show emotions that are inappropriate in the context, that people punish that. So that's our fifth hypothesis. Then the sixth one, we also expected just sort of a baseline hypothesis that people who, if you agree with the statement or the issue position presented at the poster, that you then also more likely to vote for that candidate. And then the last two hypotheses are really an interaction effect with how important the participant thinks that the issue is. So if an issue is really salient to them and important, we think it's harder to persuade them with emotions, versus if an issue is not so important to them, then maybe emotions have way more effect compared to a high salience issue. And so our conjoint experiment, we have 5 rounds, and in every round we have one issue. And I'll show the issues also later. And what we randomize is the position of the issue. So we have a center, just very middle sort of neutral position. And then we have a pro position, which is more left wing, and an against issue position that's more right wing. And then we randomize the neutral, positive or negative tone of the statement. And we randomize whether the face is neutral, happy or angry. And we use different politicians, which I also show later. And the idea is that we show two of these pictures or posters with a statement. And then we ask participants which candidate would you vote for, A or B? And we also have a feeling thermometer for each politician. And yeah, the politicians that we use are from the UK, and these are all really the same pictures, so really nice to use. We manipulated the expressions, and pre-tested them, and we selected the ones that were really highly recognizable, the emotions. And we also sort of selected politicians that were similar in attractiveness and in competence. And we have 7 statements per issue. So I have an example of one issue. This is healthcare. And then we have 3 against statements, 1 center statement, and 3 pro statements. And then for the against and pro, we have neutral, positive, and negative, and also for the pro. So the center statement is always something like, I am the healthcare candidate, or I am the immigration candidate. So that's the same for each issue. And then for example, the against for the healthcare and a negative frame is like something like healthcare costs are out of control. Whereas for pro, it's like fixing our failing healthcare. And a positive frame is more like for more efficient healthcare or for top quality healthcare. So these are a little bit similar across these issues. That's the same way how we try to manipulate these. And we also pre-tested this. Yeah, so then the results. So what we find is actually a quite strong effect of happy and positive emotions. So as you can see in the first 2 panels, that if a politician shows a happy expression, this has a very strong positive effect, so it's more likely to be chosen. Whereas if a politician shows anger in the face, people are less likely to choose that politician. And the same is for tone. So in the B panel, you see the strong positive effect of positive tone in the statement, and a negative effect of negative tone. And because of this big difference, if we combine these 2 categories, so this positive and negative, into an emotional category, we do not find an effect, as you can see in hypothesis 3 and 4. And for the 5th hypothesis, we looked at congruence. And as you can see, having incongruent or displaying incongruent emotions doesn't really have an effect. It's mostly the congruent positive emotions that has a very strong effect, and a very negative effect of showing congruent negative emotions. So this is quite interesting. I think that this negative, like being completely negative, has a super strong effect. You can even be more incongruent than be completely negative, which is, I think, quite interesting. And then we look at the interaction with this issue position and issue salience. And on the left 2 panels, you can see that even though people in general, of course, vote for the poster, the candidate that they agree with, or do not vote for if they disagree, emotions still have quite a strong effect. So, for example, if you look at the expressions on the left side and the blue lines with disagreements, you can see that if someone or a politician has a neutral or angry face, this has a negative effect. But the effect of disagreeing is actually diminished if someone is showing a happy face. So yeah, it's quite interesting that that this strong effect of disagreeing might be really altered by an unhappy face. And similarly, for example, if you look at tone, if someone is agreeing, but the statement is negative, this might also sort of question you whether you want to actually vote for this person. And then if we look at issue salience, is on the right side, we don't see any differences between the 3 categories of issue salience. So there's still a strong positive effect of happiness and a negative effect of anger, and the same is for tone. But I have to say that the category for non-salient issues is quite low, so not a lot of people actually evaluated these issues as not salient. So in general, they found these issues quite salient and important. Yeah, and then the effect of the different issues. So we showed 5 different issues. So climate, healthcare, immigration, inequality, and infrastructure. And as you can see on the expression panel, you can see that the pattern is really there. So the happiness is positive and anger is negative. But at the tone, there's a little bit more difference. But in general, there is this direction. So I'm also happy to talk about this a little bit more in the discussion. And I further analyzed whether there was also an effect of gender of the politician. And there's actually no main effect or interaction effect with emotions, which is quite interesting and also positive. And I also looked at political knowledge. There was an interaction effect if people with low political knowledge are maybe more susceptible for emotions, but there was also no effect. So yeah, to conclude, positive emotions have a strong effect. And as a politician, showing negative emotions can really have can really backfire for you. And yeah, emotions also have an effect beyond issue agreements, and individual issue salience doesn't seem to have an effect in this current study. But we are planning to do a second study in which we want to add more low salience issues. And yeah, so issues that people are not really so polarized on and are not so important to them, to see whether, how that works out. And we had some more ideas, but we probably just stick with some more low salience issues and even maybe an observational study as a third study. But I'm happy to hear your suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maaike. A really fantastic paper. Yeah, now obviously something typically as the chair would ask the first question, but it would be a bit awkward to ask a question about your own paper. So maybe Bert can ask a first question.
Yes, Mike. So this project, this part of your project obviously has been inspired by some of the questions that you've gotten over the past. So why should we care? So if you now get this question, why should we care about studying facial displays about politicians? What is your rebuttal to the beloved political scientist with less interest in psychological mechanisms?
Nice question. Yeah, so I would say, because like one comment that I got on this particular paper is that we don't take into account like political parties. But I think the importance of this paper is that you can show that even, especially when you don't know a politician, and but there is information about the issue that they portraying or their position on a certain issue, that these emotions really can persuade you in different directions. So I think especially in contexts such as, for example, in the Netherlands, we have these municipality elections in which people don't really know these politicians and even some of the parties. I think then these emotions might actually have quite a big effect.
Yeah, because could you say, if there's no question yet, could you say something about the size of the effects that we see here also compared to some of the other factors in your experiment? Like how important are these displays then? Yeah.
So if you look just at the main effect of agreeing with the issue position, I think the emotions have, which is of course a super big effect, of course you would expect, but the emotions have like at least half of the effect size of this issue position effect. So that's really quite strong in comparison, I would say, especially because a lot of political scientists always think that emotions don't have that long-lasting effect or like just a really tiny bit. But if you compare it, if it's like half the effect size, I think that's really quite big. Or maybe Gijs can also add on this, of course, if he wants.
No, I think that's a very good answer.
And I think that part you shouldn't underestimate, right? That's I think a big part of the answer to the why should we care also is that the effects are not small.
Yeah, but the one thing I could add, but we're still thinking about this a bit, is that, I mean, a lot of people expect this happiness effect to appear, right? But and I mean, there's literature on this that shows this effect to be there, although they never engage with sort of politicians actually taking issue stances. So that's our contribution. At the same time, there's also literature, different literatures that emphasize the importance of negative emotions. And so Mike already alluded to that a little bit in the extensions of this project, but it's also quite, it would be interesting to find out under what conditions these negative emotions that did even worse than we expected, under what conditions they would be favored, right?
Yeah. No, indeed, and because in some cases people do really like angry politicians, and they really feel drawn to it. But I was quite surprised that we find such a big negative effect of anger. It would be interesting to sort of see in a second study if we can sort of distinguish maybe between different groups of people or different texts in which maybe people do appreciate an angry politician.
Okay, there are lots of questions, Maaike. Let's start with Isabella. Hi, Maaike, super interesting. I'm wondering if there's an alternative way of thinking about the role of salience. Could it be that if I find an issue important, I would also expect more emotionality? Thus, high salience and low emotionality would seem like an incongruence to me. If I don't find an issue important, very high emotionality would seem misplaced.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Isabella. Yeah, I indeed was also thinking about that. But yeah, our hypothesis was really based on the fact that if people are really set already, you cannot really persuade them with emotions. But what you're saying also makes a lot of sense. So you could also, of course, argue the opposite, that if people are find an issue very important, that they feel very emotional about it and therefore also expect the politician to be emotional. So I think that's also an interesting reasoning, and we should look more into that. Yeah, we do not find any differences now, but I think it would be interesting if we also add really low salience issues in the second study.
Yeah. I'm also thinking whether emotions would always be expected in high salience. Yeah, okay, maybe, yes. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Patrick Stewart is excited to read this paper. As always, fascinating work. I would be interested in the coherence between type of issue niche, facial, I can never pronounce this word, facial physiognomy, Ryan Spicek's work, and display behavior coherence. Can you speak to that freeway interaction? Good luck, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Always nice to hear from you and get your comments. And so I think indeed it's interesting to see if there are indeed certain types of issues in which you maybe expect more anger compared to other issues. And also we were also thinking indeed to look more at facial features and to see, for example, if someone has a dominant face and is also more angry, that of course is perceived more angry. So I think indeed, in some cases, people also prefer more dominant faces, and especially maybe with certain ideologies. And display behavior. Yeah, so indeed, if there's a coherence between disagreeing with a certain issue and having a dominant face and being angry, I think, and then a type of issue that also allows for a lot of anger, I think that can be very powerful. And I think these nuances is interesting to look more into.
And especially in that light, defining that incongruent displays work better than negative displays is actually quite interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's sort of a catch-all face, that the catch-all poster. Some negativity for some and some positivity for the others. Hey, Tobias Rohrbach has a question. Cool to see these results. Do you have an idea regarding the underlying process of how emotional displays affect candidate evaluations? For example, research on likability heuristics would argue that the initial affective responses would influence later processing. Yeah,
that's a super interesting question. I also would love to do another study in which we really look at more of these mechanisms, and then also maybe physiological measurements. but I'm not sure if that's possible within my PhD. But indeed, I do
Are you looking at me?
maybe some contract extension is necessary. Already got some extra months, but no, I think it's a super interesting question. I think something we should look into. And indeed, what you're saying that happy smiles give this signal of wanting to affiliate with people, so a really warm signal, which people in generally also then also feel more positive about, so that indeed would lead to more or different processing. But yeah, there's not that much work on that yet, so I'm not sure yet how to answer this question. And I think, for example, what I'm doing with mimicry in my first papers is that people, when politicians show a happy face, like how people generally take over this. So there might be some process that is interesting to look into, like this mechanism.
Yeah. But if we're going to do mechanisms, we have to ask Chiara as well to join us. I was also thinking we could actually, in the follow-up study, we could also sort of add an information processing component where we would ask participants if they would like to read more about this candidate.
Yeah, indeed, to get more information. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Matthijs Roduin. Great study, Maaike. In the public debate, there's a lot of debate about emotions. This is mostly about negative emotions. Trump voters, Brexiteers, anti-vax protesters, etc. They're all said to be angry and angry.
The politician is angry and then especially targeted at other politicians. So I think in that context, it's also super interesting to research. But I think with campaign posters, type of media.
Yeah. There's another question by Matthijs. Could you say a bit more about what you expect regarding the role of ideology, social dominance, orientation, or authoritarianism?
Yeah, we were thinking that might be interesting to look into, because there's research showing that if you are, for example, quite conservative, that you prefer more dominant looking faces, especially facial features. And we're thinking that maybe if you're also more conservative or high on SDO, etc., that you also like more angry looking politicians. So therefore, that's what I would expect. For now, we don't find that yet, but might be interesting in a second study to add more of these measures. And that's why we are also thinking of maybe adding more variety in the faces, so more dominant looking faces compared to very low dominance, and to see if we could then find maybe this interaction.
Great. We're almost at the end, although there would be room for one short question. Maybe one of the panelists.
So Maaike, what's exactly the nature of the interaction you expect between dominance and anger?
So the interaction between people who are more conservative, that for them a dominant face that's found already in that's more attractive, but the dominant face is also looking more angry, just so that they that's really strong negative effect is lower or less strong for people who are conservative, so that they might even prefer more dominant displaying behavior of politicians. But we do not find at all now in the first study, but I think it's worth to maybe exploring this a little bit more.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so the one thing perhaps again to emphasize is that we now chose very average attractive faces. And so that's of course not the average politician. And
No.
so in a way you could also read our study as a study about diversity, like what should ugly people do to become popular politicians? For that we need to do the follow-up study. Okay, Bert, I'm going to give it back to you. Thank you, Maaike. And Chiara, you should get our Hot Politics Lab coffee mug. Mike already has 2 or so.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Maaike, and also thank you, Chiara. This is excellent. Next week we have no meeting because it is school holiday. At least the primary school are closed. And March 4th we have our own Matthijs Rodan, who will talk about a very exciting experiment that he is leading, which the title is called "Creating Empathy During a Theater Play," experimenting with over 7,000 people. So that is exciting. Then on March 11 we have my former ASCOR colleague and now at the University of Pennsylvania, Yiftach Lelkes, who will give a talk called Dynamic Media Bias. So that's March 11. On March 18, so we have our American month or American weeks, at least March 18, we have Josh Kalla from Yale University who will give a talk that will be announced, the title. And then March 25, we have Isabella Ribasso, our own Isabella Ribasso, with a to be determined talk, and Ernesto de Leon, also from the University of Bern, with a talk titled "Walking Roads to Hyperpartisan News, Online Intermediaries to COVID-19 News During the Outbreak of the Pandemic." And then April 1st, that is not a joke, we have Rune Slothuis from Aarhus University. And then we'll go on break for a couple of weeks because there are conferences and holidays and religious festivities that give us 3 days off, so, or that we can go to church, right? I leave that to everybody. Anyways, now be safe in this storm. Thanks all.
Bert will not forget to thank the sponsors right now.
Right, no, I should not forget the sponsors, right? I will definitely not forget the sponsors, to start with the Association for Politics and the Life Sciences, who are a generous sponsor, the ERC, the University of Amsterdam, and the 2 respective institutes that most of us work, the Amsterdam School of Communication Research and the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, the NWO, and who has given us more money in the last years. Or if you feel like you would want to become a sponsor, that is obviously also possible, right? We take from any small donation to big donations.
A beer sponsor would be in the next extra edition.
Excellent. Yeah. We're looking for Kea Cafe at the University of Amsterdam if they would want to become a sponsor. But how some of the we should not drink discussions at the university are playing out, I don't know if Kea will be our sponsor sooner or later, guys, but we'll see that. Hey, thanks a lot. Be safe in the storm, and see you in 2 weeks.